So I'm going to go ahead and share with you some of what I've learned since I've been researching this field in detail. The idea that dogs and cats could possibly be healthy on a vegan diet is anathema to many people who view these animals as carnivores. But it's worth considering that dogs, for example, have been co-evolving with our human ancestors for about 20 to 40,000 years. Um, They descended from entirely carnivorous wolves as we roamed across the ancient landscapes, hunting and gathering large game animals. We were followed around by wolf packs sometimes, who would seek to obtain scraps from our early human campfires, scraps from the animals that we killed and hunted. Some of these wolves were a little bit more confident and had better temperaments than some of the other wolves, and these wolves would approach more closely to our human campfires. And some of them would start to receive food scraps and start to collaborate a little bit with our early human ancestors. And these animals evolved into modern domesticated dogs, which have a greater ability to really understand and collaborate with people than any other animal. Dogs are the only species, for example, that understands what it means to point. Um, our early diets were not primarily hunted game animals. They're actually starchy root vegetables. That was the mainstay of our diets, the staples of our diets. Some of these wolves that were hanging around our early campsites had genetic mutations that enabled them to derive some limited nutritional benefit from a mixed diet of human food scraps, including a lot of starchy root vegetables. And those were adaptations such as changes in the digestive enzymes, length of the gastrointestinal tract, teeth, and so on. Uh, so those wolf hybrids did better than the original wolves that did not have those adaptations. And over a long period of time, 20 to 40,000 years, the population changed and turned into modern domesticated dogs, which do very well on a diet of mixed human food scraps. So they're very much omnivores today. Cats have had a different role. They've been encouraged to hang around our settlements to guard our food reserves, particularly our grain reserves, from rodents in particular. So they haven't been subsisting on a diet of mixed human food scraps, and they've remained very much obligate carnivores. This means that in their natural environments, they do need to hunt and kill a variety of small mammals, birds, and insects in order to fulfill their nutritional needs. This is not very relevant to modern domesticated cats who consume a variety of body parts from animals they wouldn't naturally hunt, along with various unnatural additives, packaged up into formulations such as dry kibble and fed at predictable times daily. Um, what dogs and cats need, of course, is actually a certain set of nutrients rather than any particular ingredient. And modern vegan pet foods are formulated by companies, responsible companies working with veterinary nutritional specialists or other nutritional specialists to try to ensure that all the necessary nutrients are included in the right proportions in formulations that are adequately digestible and hence bioavailable. It's mostly about digestibility and also sufficiently palatable so that the animals are happy to eat those foods. Nowadays, people are increasingly considering plant-based lifestyles for themselves and also sometimes for their pets for all of these sorts of reasons. We've got these sort of mega trends going on. There's increasing concern for health and well-being over the years and decades. This is extending to our companion animals as well. They're living longer. People are wanting better standards of healthcare for them and better diets as well. People are increasingly concerned about the environmental impacts of the livestock sector. It's the biggest cause of deforestation on the planet. It's a major freshwater user, and our recent studies indicated that it's contributed the majority of all greenhouse gases emitted to date, and I'll talk about that later on. Globally, we kill more than 90 billion land animals in the food system each year. That's just over 10 land animals for every person on the earth, along with about 1 to 3 trillion fish and marine animals. Of the farmed animals, more than 90% are intensively farmed in conditions of very high stocking density, minimal environmental enrichment, which is chronically stressful to those animals. and then they're virtually all killed at a very premature stage of life. So people are increasingly concerned about the animal welfare and ethical problems that these raise. There's also a food justice concern. About 20 years ago, there were 850 million people around the world suffering from hunger and malnutrition. And despite the passage of about 2 decades, these numbers actually haven't fallen, which is really quite appalling. And that's very much because of the overconsumption of grain in wealthy nations. That's because in wealthy nations, such as Australia, North America, Western Europe, most of that grain isn't consumed directly, but indirectly in the form of livestock produce. Because of the poor food conversion ratios, most of that grain is actually effectively lost during the conversion from plant into animal protein. The food conversion ratios vary. They seem to be worse in the case of beef and best in the case of fish, followed by chickens, but they're never one-to-one. It's always an extremely inefficient process with most of the food inputs effectively supporting the bodily maintenance processes of livestock animals rather than directly producing usable meat, milk, or eggs. Because of the overconsumption of livestock products and hence grain in wealthy nations, this means that the people in poorest nations are less able to afford the grain that does exist, resulting in grossly inequitable consumption. So the per capita grain consumption in the poorest nations is just under 30 kilograms per person per year, but in the wealthiest nations it's 96 kilograms per person per year. It's been calculated that we actually do produce enough grain to feed double the human population of the earth, but because it's consumed so inequitably, with the vast majority being consumed in wealthy nations in the form of livestock produce, we actually need 7 planet Earths to produce enough grain to feed everybody if everybody was to have a diet similar to the diet of the 20 wealthiest nations on Earth. So there we go. There's a huge food justice concern as well because of the overconsumption of livestock products, particularly in wealthy nations. So because of all these sorts of reasons, people are increasingly interested in plant-based lifestyles for themselves and also for their dogs and cats. Emerging alternatives to conventional and raw meat-based diets include traditional vegan diets based on plants, potentially yeast and fungi. I carry a sample bag around to conferences and universities when I speak on this, and I'll just show you a few of these. There have been 4 vegan pet food companies set up in the United Kingdom by veterinarians. The biggest and most successful so far is Omni. They produce a variety of vegan pet foods. They've got lots of brightly coloured packets for different medical conditions, really. Sensitive tummies, growing pups, peaceful dogs, and so on is what these various packets are called. So there are lots of those. Most of those are available via mail order rather than being available in retailers. Cultivated meat. So this is the first one of these was released onto the global marketplace in February of this year. Here it is. It's chick bites. A few cells were taken from an egg of a chicken, sourced from a farm with particularly high biosecurity standards. I presume they were stem cells, and they have been essentially cultured in culture medium and grown up into chicken tissue without the actual living chicken, and then put into dog food. So here they are, chick bites, oven-based treats for dogs. They were very successful when they were launched in London in February of this year. In a single store in London, they sold out in 2 months. There are no more now until hopefully the end of the year, more will come. There are other products like this. This is cultivated ocean fish, which will be turned into cat treats and sold within the US. It's currently undergoing FDA approval. And there are another couple of products as well in Prague and Europe, which are undergoing approval and which are also coming. So that's very exciting. And by the way, it was very hard to get hold of this stuff because it was so popular, and there was only one batch that was actually made, and for a long period of time, I said I'm not losing my samples for any reason. And then they said to me, would you like to feed them to dogs on Dutch television? And I said, absolutely, here, have all my samples. And I was very fortunate that the dogs hadn't had a full breakfast just beforehand, and they wolfed down the product on camera, along with the other vegan pet foods that we had for them. And then I had empty packets for a while, but I'm pleased to say that I've now finally managed to get some of the world's only cultivated chicken dog treats back again after being out for some time, so I can now give my talks again, which is great, and show them to you. Cellular agriculture. So this is where microorganisms are grown, and one that many people would be familiar with would be bee yeast. But in this case, we're talking about a harmless bacterium in giant steel cylinders, such as the one you can see in the bottom left there. Here's a picture of the production plant in China where this product is grown. You can see the steel cylinders. Again, there are two of them. So they look like they're about 40 meters long, perhaps. The giant steel cylinders. It takes a relatively small amount of land, very little water, and the organic inputs are offcuts from cane sugar production. This is in a cane sugar growing region of China. And the output is effectively this stuff. This is protein, microbial protein grown directly from microorganisms. This requires even less land to produce sizable quantities of protein than growing crops. So it's probably the most efficient form of food production, and maybe there'll be a lot more of this in the future. It's really interesting. Um, So this has also just been formulated into pet food. This is the world's first microbial protein-based dog food. This was released in Germany, also in February of this year by Microbel, owned by a company called Marsvet or Marsavet. And it's also just come to the UK. So there we go. We now have plant-based vegan, microbial protein vegan, and this stuff, which is definitely not vegan. This is animal tissue. This is cultivated meat products. So what we call them all? Well, vegan and cultivated meat. I also call them simply sustainable pet food, and you'll see why I would argue that meat-based pet food is not sustainable at the end of this presentation. Excuse me. The cultivated meat products are very new. They've just been released. There are no more for sale at the moment. This may become big in the future, but at the moment they hardly exist. So most of the attention at the moment is on the vegan pet food market, and there are many vegan pet foods available, certainly within Europe, within the US. I would hope that they're available in significant numbers in Australia too, if people actually go online and have a search. The sector is growing very quickly. Market assessments have shown a staggeringly fast rate of growth. As you can see there, the sector has more than tripled in global value over the last 4 years or so. It's expected to more than double in the next 10 years. The compound annual growth rate there of 8% is a bit faster than the growth of the general pet food market, which is also growing quite quickly. Interestingly, in India, which has a strong tradition of vegetarianism and over 1 billion people, I think it's the world's most populous nation at the moment. Vegan pet food is growing at 30% per annum, actually. So this growth is not uniform. In places like India, it's growing even more quickly. So what evidence has there been of the health of cats and dogs fed vegan diets? The first significant study, I would say, was conducted by a colleague of mine, actually, Dr. Lorelei Wakefield, and published in JAVMA in 2006. And she looked at 34 cats maintained on vegetarian diets for at least 1 year, 52 maintained on meat-based diets. Of the vegetarian cats, they were all vegan actually, except for 3 of them who were partly maintained on table scraps that were not always vegan. The significant, I mean, the essential summary of that table is at the bottom. There were no significant differences in age, sex, body condition, housing, or perceived health status. Most cats being described as healthy or generally healthy by their guardians. So that's a start. And then there was a study of dogs. Now, this was interesting. This was in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2009 by Brown and colleagues. And they studied sprint racing sled dogs. It's hard, I think, to consider or to find any dogs with higher exercise needs or high exercise levels and metabolic demands than dogs that pull sleds through heavy snow under competitive racing conditions for days and sometimes weeks on end up in the Arctic Circle. So these are the animals they studied. 12 sprint racing Siberian Huskies said either a commercial diet for active dogs or a meat-free diet following the same nutrient specifications. So this might have been vegetarian, it might not have been vegan, not quite sure. There's a sole nutrient intake for 4 months, including 10 weeks of competitive racing. Blood samples collected at the beginning, end, and throughout, and veterinary health checks likewise. Hematology results for all dogs were within normal range. There was actually a increased red blood cell count evidenced by all of the dogs, which was considered a normal athletic adaptation to sustained exercise. And the consulting vet assessed all dogs to be in excellent physical condition. So there we go, no harm, it seemed, to those particular dogs. The numbers in the sample, however, were very small. In the next major study was conducted by myself and a PhD student of mine and published in the Open Access Scientific Journal Animals in 2016. We reviewed all the evidence of nutritional soundness and health, nutritional soundness of diets and the health of animals maintained on them that had been published by that time. And we went back to the manufacturers and got some additional information. And the result of all of that is we concluded that both dogs and cats may thrive on these diets, but they need to be nutritionally complete and reasonably balanced. So that was vegetarian diets, but the same would apply to vegan diets. There weren't that many vegan diets available back then in 2016. And so that was it until about 4 years ago, when in the last 4 years things went berserk and a large amount of research has appeared in this field. This is about the first really exciting one. This is by Dr. Sarah Dodd and colleagues. So Sarah is a veterinary nutritional specialist, and she was based at Guelph Veterinary School in Canada. And these are her colleagues at Guelph Veterinary School in Canada. And she also became, I think, the world's first veterinarian to complete a PhD in vegan pet food a couple of years ago. I did one last year, but I'm not a veterinary nutritional specialist. I'm a welfare specialist. So Sarah is a nutritionist as well as a PhD in vegan pet food. And she and her colleagues have published about 1/3 of the research in this field, and myself and my colleagues have also published about 1/3 of the research. So we certainly talk to Sarah and her colleagues sometimes. So this was the first study that they published, and it was very exciting. So they found, essentially, after looking at more than 1,000 cats, that fewer cats fed plant-based diets, and that's the terminology they used to refer to vegan diets in this study, had gastrointestinal and liver disorders. By the way, that's the same as they found in dogs. And they were also less likely to be overweight and obese. And more owners of cats fed these diets reported their cat to be in very good health. They looked at the lifespans of previously owned cats, and those fed vegan diets are indicated by the green curve. The other curves indicate meat-based or mixed diets. And it looks like the cats fed vegan diets are actually living longer than cats fed meat-based diets. In this case, the difference wasn't statistically significant. Do try to remember roughly this curve though, because I'm going to show you a similar one relating to dogs later on, which is really interesting. Sarah and colleagues also surveyed pet guardians, and they looked at more than 3,000 pet guardians, and they found that 35% who were not already feeding a vegan diet for their pet indicated interest in doing so. That study was primarily North American Canadian, and it showed that 35% would have been interested in feeding these diets. There's certain things that they wanted the diets to offer, further evidence of nutritional sufficiency and veterinary approval in 20%. In 2020, myself and colleagues at the University of Winchester in the UK conducted an even larger survey. We looked at more than 4,000 pet guardians, And ours were primarily UK European, but there were all countries, or certainly all major regions were represented, including Australia. We found that 54% said that they would not be interested in alternatives, but 46% were interested in alternatives to conventional or raw meat-based diets. So, recalling that Dodd and colleagues, primarily North American Canadians, found that 35% were interested. We found that 46% were interested, looking at UK European, primarily UK European audiences. So that gives an idea of the range of pet guardians that are probably interested in these sorts of alternatives. And you can see that that's a significant minority of all pet owners. The types of alternatives they said they would be interested in, the most popular was lab-grown or cultivated meat, and that was followed by vegetarian and vegan diets. And as I mentioned, cultivated meat products have not existed on the marketplace until February of this year, and they're now unavailable until the next batch is released, so they're very hard to get. On the other hand, vegan pet foods are now widely available in many regions, mostly online. So my research is actually focused on vegan pet foods. The pet guardian said there were many characteristics of the alternatives they would want to be offered before they would realistically consider choosing them. And the top five were these. They wanted to be satisfied that the health of their pets would be good, that the diets would be nutritionally sound and of good quality, they'd be adequately palatable so the pets would enjoy eating them, and they'd be adequately environmentally sustainable. Interestingly, cost was not in the top five. It came in at number 6 on the list. These priorities broadly reflect the survey by Dodd and colleagues and other surveys in the field as well. So my research since this 2020 survey is focused on each of these 5 areas. I've been publishing studies addressing each of these 5 areas, and there's now a considerable body of research in total doing that. With respect to health, for example, we surveyed more than 2,500 dog owners feeding either conventional meat, raw meat, or vegan diets to their dogs. This is the largest study of its kind that's been done so far. I asked people whether dogs had needed to visit vets an unusually high number of times in the previous year, whether they needed any kind of medication or not. So I'm looking for indications that there might be some kind of illness going on, whether after initially being on a vegan or a meat-based diet of some kind, the dog needed to progress onto a medical diet. If they'd seen their veterinarian recently and were confident of the vet's health status, what was the vet's health status? What was their own opinion about the health of their animals? What percentage of these animals was considered unwell based upon the reported veterinary assessment? And if they were unwell, did they have just one health disorder or was it more than one? What was the average number of cases of illness per unwell dog? We also looked at the 22 most common health disorders in all of these dogs. And after controlling for differences in the dietary groups using regression models, so controlling for age, sex, neutering status, breed size, and exercise level, the 7 general indicators of illness are those across the x-axis, increased numbers of veterinary visits, medication usage, and so on. We found that dogs fed vegan diets, indicated by the green dots, and sometimes also dog fed raw meat diets, indicated by the orange dots, had lower rates of all 7 of those general indicators of illness than dogs fed conventional meat, which is indicated by the dashed horizontal line. We then went further and calculated for an average dog, so average age, sex, neutering status, breed size, and exercise level, what was the chance of having one of these 7 indicators of illness, indicated by the rows, if they were fed conventional meat, indicated in the first numerical column, or fed vegan diets, indicated by the second numerical column, and then what was the reduction when a vegan diet was fed, indicated by the third numerical column. And the reductions varied from about 14 up to 51% in the chances of having these indicators of illness. We did the same thing comparing vegan diets to raw meat diets. And again, there were reductions in most of those categories, but there were increases in 2 of them. In these particular cases, we think that the increases were due to non-medical reasons. The percentage of dogs that was unwell in their three dietary groups, as you can see there, 49% fed conventional meat, 43% fed raw meat, 36% fed vegan diets. And for dogs that were unwell, there was 1.6 cases of illness for conventional meat dogs and about 1.5 for the other two groups. Considering the 22 most common health disorders in these dogs, the most common were gastrointestinal, followed by skin and coat, followed by other musculoskeletal problems. And the chances of suffering from one of these 22 health disorders was highest when dogs were fed conventional meat for 11 out of 22, raw meat for 8 out of 22, and vegan diets for 3 out of 22. Excuse me. So, based on that, it was clear that the healthiest diets were nutritionally sound vegan diets. I always say nutritionally sound because it's so important that diets are well formulated in order to be nutritionally sound. They're also the least hazardous. There've actually been more than 80 studies now showing increased pathogenic risks associated with raw meat diets, risks to both the animals and also the humans that share animals, humans that share households with their animals when people are feeding raw meat. I don't know of any other area of veterinary medicine where there are 80 studies showing anything. So I'd say this is one of the most well-established aspects in all of veterinary medicine. If anyone is interested in the list of 80 studies, they are on my website, sustainablepetfood.info, under meat-based diets, under one of the appendices. So there we go. The healthiest diets with the fewest dietary hazards are certainly nutritionally sound vegan diets. We published this as a series of 2 studies in the open access scientific journal PLOS One, one of the world's leading general open access scientific journals. And also here in Helion after controlling for differences in age, sex, neutering status, and body condition, and so on. This attracted a lot of interest. These studies were reported in more than 400 news outlets globally, including this feature article in New Scientist in 2022. And when the second study was published, there were more than 1,000 comments on the Channel 9 news website story in Australia in the first 24 hours. However, exciting though those studies might have been, they weren't as exciting as this one, I think. This was published again by Dodd and colleagues. This time they looked at nearly 1,200 dog guardians, including 357 feeding solely vegan diets for 3 years on average. Vegan dogs more likely to be in very good health, less likely to suffer from gastrointestinal and liver disorders. That's the same as they found for cats, if you might recall. Also less likely to suffer from ocular disorders. They also looked at the previously owned dogs. There were more than 1,200 of them. Once again, there were the lifespan curves. So the vegan diets indicated by the green curve appeared to be living longer, again, than the meat-based dogs indicated by the other 2 curves, just as we saw with cats. You might recall that with cats, this difference was not statistically significant. For the dogs, however, it was. And you can see there that the dogs were living an average of 1.5 years longer than dogs fed meat-based diets. So I think this is hugely significant. I think this is probably the most exciting single finding that's come out of all of the healthcare studies. We sometimes say in veterinary practice that 1 year of a dog's life equates to about 7 years of a human life. If true, then that would mean that these dogs were living the equivalent of an extra decade of human life at the end of their lifespans. And if we think of the significance of that, what it would mean to have an extra decade of life, we can appreciate how important this is. They don't just have extra quantity of life, they seem to have improved the quality of life as well, because across all of the studies of health outcomes in dogs fed vegan diets, and there are quite a lot of these now, as I'll show you in a sec, there are a couple of consistent clusters of healthcare benefits. One seems to relate to not consuming animal-sourced allergens. About 80% of dietary allergens in dogs are animal-based, not plant-based. So when you cut those out, you get, well, what we're consistently getting across the studies is reduction in gastrointestinal problems, also itchy skin and ear canal problems. So these are conditions that can significantly impact the quality of life of dogs. and are very common, as you'd be aware. And it's also true that nearly half of all dogs and cats, perhaps more than half, are overweight and obese nowadays. The other consistent benefit that's coming up across multiple studies is that dogs and cats that are overweight and obese tend to slim down and may achieve a normal body weight when fed vegan diets and have concomitant improvements in mobility and a reduction in musculoskeletal disorders. So there we go. We're having animals that seem to have improved quality of life as this study indicated, more time as well, something like the equivalent of an extra decade of life in the case of these dogs. So I think that's hugely exciting uh, for the health and welfare implications for these dogs. Across all of the health studies, there are now 12 studies or veterinary student master's theses in two cases, and one systematic review, which have examined health outcomes in dogs maintained on vegan or vegetarian diets. If you click on my website, sustainablepetfood.info, under the health tab, you'll get a page that looks like this. There'll be about one paragraph summarizing each of these studies with a link through to the full text study. So they're all freely available online. 11 out of 12 now support the use of these diets. They indicate equivalent or superior health outcomes when using them. The only one that doesn't, by the way, is the oldest, smallest study with the least realistic study conditions, involving dogs that were force rested, I think, cage rested for about 6 weeks and then put on a treadmill and forced to run at 12 kilometers an hour for 4 hours a day. And the sample size was extremely tiny. Eventually, one tiny difference was detected between dogs fed meat-based and vegan diets, but this has no relevance to dogs, I would say, in the real world, and also contradicts all of the other studies in the field. So it's clear that the weight of evidence overwhelmingly supports the use of nutritionally sound vegan dog food. So what about cats? Well, we did the same kind of study in more than 1,300 cats fed either meat-based or vegan diets. This is also the largest in the field. This time we didn't split into cats fed raw meat and conventional meat because the numbers were smaller. We simply kept them combined as cats. Once again, after controlling for age, sex, neutering status, and this time also for location, we're interested in the idea that perhaps some of the vegan cats might have been going outdoors and hunting, so we control for location as well. We found that cats fed vegan diets, indicated by the blue dots, had lower risks of all of these general indicators of illness across the x-axis than cats fed meat-based diets, indicated by the dashed horizontal line. The 95% confidence intervals are indicated by the extent of the lines coming out of those dots. So the whiskers, we sometimes call them. And as you can see, they all cross the horizontal line, indicating that none of these differences were actually statistically significant individually, but collectively they do constitute quite a strong trend. We did the same thing as we had done for dogs, working out for cats, average cats, so that's average age, sex, neutering status, and location. What was the chance of having one of these general indicators of illness if they were fed meat? And that's indicated by the first numerical column. If they were fed vegan diets in the second column, and what was the reduction on the vegan diets? And as you can see, the reduction for cats fed vegan diets varied from about 4% up to 55% across all of these 7 general indicators of illness. The percentage of cats that was assessed as being unwell was 42% fed meat and 37% fed vegan diets. And when they were unwell, the average number of cases of illness 1.6 when fed meat and 1.3 when fed vegan diets. The 22 most common health disorders were these. In cats, they were slightly different from those in dogs. Dental and oral problems were top of the list, followed by body weight, almost always being overweight, and then gastrointestinal problems. And the chances of suffering from one of these disorders was highest when they were fed meat for 2/3 of them, and highest when they were fed vegan diets for 1/3 of them. Almost none of these differences individually were statistically significant, however. Excuse me. So overall, the healthiest diets, again with the fewest dietary hazards, were clearly vegan diets. But again, I emphasize that, of course, these diets do have to be well formulated to be nutritionally complete and balanced. We also published this in PLOS One recently. And across the field, there are now 3 studies that have examined health outcomes in cats, so not as many as dogs. Um, and you can find them again at sustainablepetfood.info under the health tab. Again, you'll get a short summary of each study and a link through to the full text study if you'd like to have a look at it. All 3 support the use of these diets. There is actually one more. There's one that didn't, but this was a diet many years ago that was deliberately formulated to be deficient in potassium. And after being fed to cats as a sole nutrient intake for an extended period of time, the cats eventually displayed signs of potassium deficiency. So I don't consider that to be a credible study. I would say that out of studies that have looked at diets which have not been deliberately formulated to be nutritionally deficient, there are 3 such studies, and all 3 support the use of vegan or vegetarian diets. But again, it is important that the diets be formulated to be nutritionally sound. So it's clear that the weight of evidence, again, supports the use of nutritionally sound vegan cat food. There are simply no credible studies showing any contrary result. So these studies satisfy the first concern that our surveyed pet guardians said that they had. There are now collectively 14 studies showing good health outcomes in dogs and cats, of course, providing the diet is nutritionally sound. Regarding whether the diets are nutritionally sound and of good quality, this time to study this, we didn't study health outcomes, we studied manufacturing processes. We wanted to see whether there were differences in steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness and good quality between manufacturers producing meat-based or plant-based pet foods. And the plant-based were vegan, vegetarian, or almost vegan diets. And we found 19 companies producing meat-based and 10 producing plant-based diets. And in this study, we studied every step during from initial formulation of the diet through to final storage and shipping to see whether there were differences in steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness and quality. So with respect to formulation, we asked whether companies were working with veterinary nutritional specialists, PhD nutritionists, or relying simply upon in-house expertise, for example. How they were ensuring the soundness of the diets. Were they formulating to meet the nutritional guidelines of European or US authorities, for example? Were they conducting feeding trials? That's where you use a colony of dogs or cats in a laboratory and you feed them their test diet as a sole nutrient intake for 6 months, and you assess the effects on the animals at the end. That's rarely done, but it is occasionally done. What steps were taken to ensure the quality of the ingredients? Did companies go out and physically inspect the ingredient production plants? Did they rely upon paper agreements? What were they doing? Were the companies supplementing appropriately to ensure that all necessary nutrients are included? Because this needs to be done for both meat-based and vegan diets. For example, many people are aware of the amino acid taurine, which is an essential amino acid that needs to be supplied within the diets of cats, not dogs. They can manufacture it from others, but certainly within cats. Taurine naturally occurs within meat, but it was found, I think, in the 1970s that cats consuming meat-based pet food were suffering from taurine deficiency. They were getting signs of taurine deficiency. Taurine is essential, and without adequate taurine, eventually cats will suffer retinal problems, cardiac problems, birth defects, and other disorders. So it was found that cats consuming meat-based pet food were suffering from taurine deficiency. And how could this be so? Because taurine, of course, is included within meat. Well, it was because the very high temperatures and pressures used during the production of pet food were actually degrading some of the fragile nutrients. So not robust nutrients such as minerals, but certainly unraveling some of the amino acids, including taurine, and probably degrading some of the more fragile vitamins as well. So it's necessary that after processing is finished, both meat-based and vegan diets be supplemented. So the problem with taurine was solved by simply adding synthetic taurine to the meat-based pet food after processing was finished. And the same synthetic taurine, of course, is added to vegan pet diets as well. In fact, of commercial pet foods, meat-based pet foods nowadays, they are on average just under 50% plant material and 50% or just over 50% animal-based materials. Um, so they're certainly both supplemented with a range of nutrients, and vegan diets are the same as the meat-based diets, but without the meat and more of the plant-based materials and more supplementation going on. The next thing we looked at was preservation methods to see whether companies were using heat, cooling, whether they were using antimicrobials, antifungals, humectants to adequately dry food, flavorants, colorants, whether they were monitoring the diets to assess degradation of nutrient levels in warehouses over time because some of these degrade, whether they were over supplementing appropriately to take account of degradation of nutrients over time, and whether they had good protocols for their retailers and during storage and shipping, and ultimately for the end stage consumers. So after doing all of that pretty thoroughly, we found that most companies were doing things pretty well at most stages throughout the production process. There were some small areas in which most companies could improve. There were not substantial differences between meat-based and vegan diets. If anything, companies producing the plant-based diets had a slight edge. They were doing things slightly better. We theorized this was probably because these diets were newer and more controversial, and companies were probably being extra careful to make sure that they were adequately supplementing these diets nutritionally and taking steps to ensure nutritional soundness of these products. So there certainly wasn't any concern systematically that vegan diets were nutritionally unsound. There have been a small number of studies showing that particular products have been formulated incorrectly and are nutritionally unsound, but there have actually been more studies showing the same thing with respect to meat-based diets. But when you look at the industry systematically, as I said, there aren't a lot of differences. If anything, the plant-based diets seem to be being formulated slightly more carefully and are slightly less likely to be nutritionally unsound. So, what about palatability? That was the fourth concern that our surveyed pet guardians said that they had. Many people think that it is cruel to force these obligate carnivores to consume vegan diets. Other people point out that actually dogs and cats sometimes display the ability to enjoy ingredients that are entirely unnatural to them. And Jed Gillen, in his book Obligate Carnivore, addresses this point better than I could. He said, if you're not sure that cats can do this, he said, try this experiment. Skip your cat's breakfast one morning and bring him or her to the beach instead. Driven by hunger, what natural instincts might kick in? What are the chances that your cat will splash into the water, swim 50 or so miles out in the deep ocean, and thereby engage a 1,200-pound animal, because an adult tuna can be as large as a horse? That's assuming they can find one, of course, because they're rapidly becoming depleted in the oceans. Thereby engage a 1,200-pound animal in an underwater battle to the death in order to fulfill the natural feline diet of fish. The idea that fish is a natural food for cats is absurd. They are descended from desert creatures and are notoriously hydrophobic. Have you ever given your cat a bath? So there we go. He makes the point very well that cats and, of course, dogs seem to be able to enjoy ingredients that are entirely unnatural to them. Nevertheless, some people continue to maintain that it's cruel to force these animals to consume unnatural ingredients. And I think better than humans arguing back and forth at one another, why don't we simply ask the animals? And how do we do that? Of course, by studying their behavior at feeding time. So we did this as well. There have been a number of smaller studies doing the same thing, but this is the largest one. We studied more than 2,300 dogs, fed conventional meat, raw meat, or vegan diets. We looked at every indicator of palatability that had been described in the scientific literature and some others from our veterinary experience as well. Did the dogs wolf down their food? Did they race up to their food bowls, wag their tail, sniff their food, jump, vocalize, and so on? We did a similar study with more than 1,100 cats, also fed these three main dietary groups. For cats, there were 15 indicators of palatability. There was lots of flicking of ears and tails and licking of lips and noses and food and bowls and sniffing and investigating. The first thing we did was we studied how likely all of these animals were to display these various palatability indicators when they were fed at different diets. We started by working out which of these behaviors co-varied consistently with one another and also with previous study results. And that enabled us to identify some of these as being positive indicators and some as being negative indicators of palatability. For the cats, there were a few where we couldn't group them as being either positive or negative, and we considered them to be indeterminate. But for most of these, we were able to identify them as being either positive or negative signs of palatability. Having done that, we then worked out how those positive and negative indicators varied across the three different diets. And once we analysed all that statistically and looked for statistically significant differences, we found the results from our studies, which concurred with the limited prior studies, didn't support views that vegan pet food may have reduced palatability. There was pretty much no significant difference between the three different dietary groups. There were small differences, but overall, no significant differences. So there you go. This kind of makes sense as well. If a company produces a product which is not adequately palatable for dogs and cats, there's no fooling them. They simply won't eat the diet. The company will rapidly go out of business. So clearly, any product that survives in the marketplace for any period of time must be adequately palatable, or it simply won't be eaten. So we published that study also in PLOS One in 2021. So these are the first four concerns that the surveyed pet guardians said that they had about these diets. And the final one, of course, is environmental sustainability. And this, I think, is where it becomes most exciting. We have had many estimates of the greenhouse gas emissions created by the livestock sector. One of the most reliable recent ones was published by Zhu and colleagues in Nature Food in 2021. They established that about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions globally come from the food system. Excuse me. And the livestock sector produces about 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not the top cause each year. That would be fossil fuel production and consumption, but certainly one of the top causes. To put the emissions from the food system in context, have a look at this. These are the emissions that would be produced roughly between now and the end of this century in the top row, the blue row, just from the food system. If we carry on with no change under the business as usual model, there would be 1356 gigatons of CO2 equivalents are likely to be produced from the food system. The next two rows indicate the gigatons of CO2 equivalents that can be produced to give us a chance of keeping the planetary surface temperature 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. The top row would give us a 2/3 chance if we emit 500 gigatons of CO2 equivalents, and the second row would give us a 50% chance of reaching the 1.5 degree target if we emit a bit more, 705 gigatons. As you can see, the emissions from the food system alone completely obliterate any realistic chance of keeping the planetary surface temperature at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. And we have many times been told by climate scientists that 1.5 degrees is a tipping point at which positive feedback mechanisms will be triggered that will accelerate climate change still further. The next two rows are the equivalents if we were to keep the planetary surface temperature 2 degrees above pre-industrial averages. And as you can see, the emissions from the food system alone, not considering all other sectors of society, just the food system, seriously threaten our chances of keeping the surface temperature 2 degrees above pre-industrial averages. Excuse me. So seriously, the food system the emissions from food system are obviously very unsustainable, and substantial change clearly needs to occur to this sector if we are to realistically be able to reach any of these targets. The Eat Lancet committee was a collaboration of 37 world-leading scientists that came together a couple of years ago to work out how much reduction would be required in livestock consumption products to feed a projected future population of 10 billion people sustainably within planetary boundaries. And as you can see, there are substantial reductions in all categories there. Meat, milk and dairy, eggs, fish and seafood were recommended in order to be able to achieve that. In the right-hand column, we see a similar set of targets that were calculated by ProVeg International, the world's largest plant-based dietary organization. What about pet diets, however? Um, one of the first major studies of the impacts of pet diets was published by Okken from University of California, Berkeley, also in PLOS One. And he calculated that in the US, more than a quarter, so 25-30% of the environmental impacts of animal production in terms of land, water, fossil fuels, pesticides, and fertilizers are attributable actually to pet food, not to human consumption. That's really interesting. If we go back to recalling that 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally are due to the livestock sector, and if we add Okken's calculation that more than a quarter of those are not due to human consumption, they're due to pet consumption. If we just look at the lower end, a quarter, that would mean that if Okken's calculations were applicable globally, it would mean 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally were due to pet food, not due to human food consumption. That's really interesting because we know that the entire transportation sector has been calculated as producing about 13.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And in response to that, we have armies of people around the world working on sustainable transport solutions. We have vast numbers of people and billions of dollars going into that sector. And here we have a sector which may be responsible for perhaps 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And we don't have armies of people working on that. We've basically got one person working on that full time, which is me, along with Dot and her colleagues when they can produce studies in this area, along with the companies producing vegan pet food products and very few others. So I would say this is probably the most neglected area within the entire environmental and plant-based movement space, actually. I want to show you why it's potentially the most beneficial as well. There have been several studies looking at the impacts of meat-based diets, but vegan diets also have impacts. Nobody had worked out what the difference would be and hence what the savings would be environmentally if the world's dogs and cats were transitioned onto vegan diets. So I set out to do this in my most recent study. I used the year 2018 for dog and cat populations because this was the most recent year for which I could source reasonably reliable numbers of dogs and cats globally. For that year, I wanted to work out how many food animals would no longer be slaughtered if the world's pet dogs and cats transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan diets. What would the savings be in land, water, fossil fuels, pesticides and fertilizers, and greenhouse gases? And also with the food energy savings, how many additional people could you actually feed? It wasn't really possible to do this until 2020 because there hadn't been a report giving us information about the ingredients used in pet food within a really large scale that was publicly available. And in 2020, a report was actually produced which covered 2/3 of the US pet food industry, which is the biggest single market in the world. Finally, we had detailed information about more than 500 ingredients used within pet food in the US, livestock animal species, tonnages, and so on. So I made use of that. I calculated the dietary energy needs of dogs, cats, and humans in the same year within the US. And as I say, the most recent year for which I could do this globally was 2018 because that was the year for which I had reliable numbers of cats and dogs globally. So for the global calculations, I used 2018. I also used published data about the environmental impacts of all of the animal-based ingredients used and what the impacts would be if plant-based ingredients were used instead. And I was able to work out that within the US, which is a high pet owning nation, because it's a relatively wealthy and developed nation, humans consume about 80% of all the livestock animals, but dogs and cats consume 20%. And this is even after accounting for the use of animal byproducts. That equates, well, globally, I should say that the humans consume about 91%, and pet ownership is lower than in the US. Pet ownership, pets consume about 9% of all livestock animals, about 6 billion livestock animals for dogs, and 1 billion for cats, and 71 billion for humans. That was back in 2018. And you can see the breakdowns by species here. 78 billion land animals killed globally, and you can see most of them are poultry, pigs, sheep, and goats, and the other species. And you can see the numbers killed for dogs and cats and globally. By the way, this infographic is available under my environmental study, which is in PLOS One, published in the Open Access Journal PLOS One. If you click on the comments tab, you get access to this infographic. So globally, the proportion of land animals consumed by dogs and cats is 9%, less than the 20% in the US. That's because the US is a high pet owning nation because it's a wealthy and developed nation. The US figures are probably also similar to those within Australia, within Western Europe, and other wealthy high pet owning regions of the world. So probably 20%, roughly speaking, of land animals are not being killed to feed people. They're being killed to feed dogs and cats in these regions. There's also billions of fish and marine animals are being killed each year. And there's about 1 to 3 trillion killed globally, and there will certainly be billions killed to feed dogs and cats. I haven't included those in the calculations. These simply relate to land animals. If all of the dogs in the first column, cats in the second column, and humans, for comparison, in the third column, were transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, there'd be vast savings of greenhouse gases. So if all the dogs were to transition, for example, you would free up more greenhouse gases than produced by the entire United Kingdom. In fact, 1.5 times as many greenhouse gases as produced by the entire United Kingdom. If all the cats were to transition, that would spare more greenhouse gases than produced by New Zealand. And if all the humans were to transition, more than the entire EU. There'd be massive savings of land. For example, if all the humans were to transition, you'd free up land larger than Russia, which is the world's biggest country, combined with India, which would become available for reforestation, carbon capture, and biodiversity increase. There'd be vast savings of fresh water, and millions of additional people could be fed with food energy savings. For example, if all the cats were to transition, you'd be able to feed almost 70 million additional people, which is more people than live in the United Kingdom. If all the dogs were to transition, that'd be 449 million additional people, more than the human population of the EU. And if all the humans were to transition, that'd be 5.3 billion additional people, which is 2/3 of the current population of the Earth. And some studies show that you could actually feed more people than that. Maybe you'd be able to feed double the population of the Earth. However, the results I have here, although these demonstrate very large sustainability benefits, are actually very conservative results. Throughout my study, they're actually very conservative results, even though they demonstrate these massive benefits. So that was published in PLOS One in 2023. And we've just published a summary of this actually, and all of the other relevant environmental studies looking at the relative environmental impacts of meat-based versus vegan diets in Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems. And that was published about just under a week ago, actually. We've got a press release going out on this today, actually. We've also published a short summary of this in the online journal Plant-Based News, if anyone is interested in a short summary. So really just to wrap up and reiterate, last year was the hottest year on record. We know that climate change and environmental degradation are the leading threats to life on Earth. We are living through the 6th mass extinction event at the moment since fossil records began. These are periods when the majority of all living creatures die within a very short period of time, the equivalent of a few human lifespans. The biggest threat to life on Earth is certainly climate change and environmental degradation. We know that the greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture are so large that we cannot ignore them and have a realistic chance of effectively addressing these challenges. This has been further highlighted within some more studies that have recently occurred. This is Svetlana Fain from New Zealand, and a bunch of us recently published a systematic review of all solutions to the climate change problem that have been published in the scientific literature in the last 20 years. And as you would expect, there was significant focus on fossil fuel consumption and production. There was focus on transportation systems, on changes to the built environment, but it also became very clear that wholesale change to the food system is very much required for us to realistically address the climate change problem. If anyone wants a shorter summary, we've published a summary recently in Oxford Open Climate Change as well. And then just a very short time ago, this year, we had this really exciting study from Wedderburn Bishop come out that showed actually when you use modern and consistent climate accounting measures, it turns out that the emissions from the livestock sector are actually about 52% of all greenhouse gas emissions to date. So not per year, it's not the biggest cause per year at the moment. It's one of the top causes, but fossil fuel consumption would be the biggest cause at the moment. But historically, the majority of all emissions in the atmosphere actually come from the livestock sector, in particular from land clearing to grow feed crops to feed to livestock animals and to graze livestock animals at pasture. Just emphasizing how big a problem the livestock sector is in terms of contributing to climate change and environmental degradation. So it's clear that there's actually a substantial body of research now fulfilling their top 5 concerns that our surveyed pet guardians said they had. And it's worth remembering that when I put up this slide showing the rapid increase in the growth of this sector globally and the market valuations of it, this is despite the fact that 99.9% of pet guardians don't know the information that I've just presented to you. They don't know that the top concerns about these alternative diets that they said that they had have now actually been met by this body of research. And I think that as pet owners become increasingly aware of it, this sector is going to go up even more quickly. I'd say it has a very bright future. In terms of outreach and awareness raising, I've been doing my bit in Veterinary Times, the major veterinary journal here in the United Kingdom, which is distributed to all UK veterinary practices weekly, and summarising the evidence about health status of dogs and cats and other aspects. And there's been quite good coverage. So I'd say most vets in the UK are now pretty well aware of that vegan diets exist, that modern vegan diets have been formulated to be nutritionally sound, and know something about the health evidence concerning these diets. In the UK, we've had the UK Pet Food Manufacturers Association 2 years ago update its fact sheet, affirming that vegan diets are valid, legitimate products for manufacturers to be producing, provided that they're carefully formulated in order to be nutritionally sound for dogs and for cats. And very excitingly, last year, after years of stating their opposition to vegan diets in media interviews and me getting up in the same interviews and saying that their position was ignorant of all of the scientific evidence in the field that has occurred recently, was outdated and contrary to good animal welfare and environmental sustainability. Eventually, they set up a commission to examine vegan pet diets and companion animal feeding generally. And that took quite a long time, and they came out with their report. And the result of that was that the British Association finally ended their opposition to vegan diets. They now support these diets, at least for dogs, providing that they're carefully formulated to be nutritionally sound. So that's the first time in the world that a veterinary association has come out officially supporting the use of these diets, and that's probably of similar significance to decades ago when the first Human Medical Association did the same for vegan diets for people. In closing, I'd like to emphasize these things. There have been a body of studies showing that when people formulate homemade diets, even when they follow recipes and use nutritional supplements, and even when those people are experts themselves, quite often the results are unfortunately nutritionally unsound. So I don't recommend that people try to do this unless they've got no choice. I recommend that people attempt to purchase their diets from modern pet food companies, responsible companies that should be working with veterinary or other nutritionists and carefully formulating diets to make sure they are nutritionally sound. People should be checking the packaging to make sure that it says that it's a nutritionally complete diet, not simply intended as a treat or a snack. And the company should be able to provide some basic information about steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness. If a company won't supply any information, won't answer inquiries, then that should be a red flag and people should go elsewhere. I also recommend that, as with any dietary transition, people do things gradually. Of course, animals have a variety of personalities. Some animals have a reputation for wolfing down their food first and asking questions later. Some can be quite the opposite, particularly old animals that have been maintained on a particular flavour of meat-based diet for many years and can be very reluctant to transition. My website has a summary article with tips for transitioning that talk about dietary additives, which can ease the transition and can make these new diets a little bit more palatable. Regardless of the animal, I would advise a gradual transition of at least a couple of weeks, even if the animal is very enthusiastic, to allow things like the digestive enzymes to transition and the bacteria within the gastrointestinal tract to transition, thereby minimizing chances of adverse reactions such as diarrhea. And I guess I'd suggest that with any dietary change, a gradual transition rather than a sudden change. If pet guardians don't get 100% of the way there because they do have one of these very fussy animals that's very reluctant to change, I would be encouraging if people even get 50% of the way there after 6 months. That would still be 50% of the environmental benefits and potentially some health benefits as well. And that's nothing to dismiss. That's still something that's very good. So any a change in this direction, I think, would be a good thing. I'd like to thank my co-authors, my various studies, most of who are statisticians. Acknowledge my funding sources: Food System Research Fund, food awareness organisations representing animals, and ProVeg International, and a couple of pet food companies. But also point out that none of my funders had any role in anything that might have altered the data or the analysis or the publications that resulted. I don't have 4,000 pet owning friends on social media, so to reach more than 4,000 pet guardians, I relied upon a small army of volunteers and assistants as well. So I'm grateful to them as well. As I said, most of these studies are available via the tabs at the top of my website, sustainablepetfood.info. So please do have a look there if you're interested. So that's it. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And I'm happy to take questions or comments now if anyone's got any.
Just before you do so, thank you so much, Andrew, for that wonderful presentation. This is Rosemary here from Sentient. Before the questions, I have to work out, Andrew, how to stop recording, so we don't record our Q&A. So are you able to turn the recording off your end?
It should be at the same place where you click the record
It
and
isn't. It isn't. I could do
actually
reset to default.
I've got a stop recording. I'm going to